Imagine you are an American, sitting comfortably in your living room, scrolling through YouTube late at night. You click on a Cold War story, expecting missile silos and spy planes. Instead, what you find are parents carrying sleeping children through minefields, homemade hot air balloons made from stolen bed sheets, and a little girl hidden in the trunk of an American soldier's car at Checkpoint Charlie. These are stories about the Cold War that almost never make it into textbooks. Stories where the main characters are not just spies and presidents, but kids. Stories where Soviet officers stare at American technology in disbelief, while ordinary families use whatever they can build with their own hands to break through a wall built to keep them prisoners. Tonight, you will hear those stories. And by the end, you might look at the Cold War not just as a distant chess match between superpowers, but as a series of bets, parents betting everything on the idea that there was a freer, more advanced, more hopeful world on the other side of the border. Let's start where the Cold War became concrete, literally, in the gray slabs of the Berlin Wall. When the Berlin Wall went up in 1961, it wasn't just a line on a map, it was a message. The Soviet-backed East German regime was saying to its own citizens, "You do not leave, ever." Barbed wire became concrete. Concrete became watchtowers. Fields became killing zones, striped with raked sand to show every footprint, seeded with mines, covered by machine guns whose operators had standing orders to shoot anyone who tried to run, including women and children. From space, later American satellites would photograph this border like a scar across Europe, revealing bunkers, patrol roads, and the geometry of an entire system built to hold people in. On the ground, families on the eastern side stared at that same wall and saw something different. They saw a cage around their kids' future. In school, children were taught to praise the party, to memorize slogans, to report suspicious behavior, even inside their own families. On television, they were shown images of American cities as crime-ridden, racist, collapsing under capitalism, while Soviet and East German propaganda insisted that the West was technologically backward compared to the socialist utopia. But reality had a way of leaking in. American radio signals slipped through the jamming. West German TV, picked up with improvised antennas, showed supermarkets full of food, shiny cars, and smiling kids running through suburbs with backyards and bicycles. Some parents looked at their sleeping children and thought, if they grow up here, they'll never know what it is to choose their own life. And then, slowly, quietly, dangerously, they began to plan. There is something almost insane about deciding to build a hot air balloon in your garage to fly your kids over landmines and machine guns, but that is exactly what two East German families did in the late 1970s. Their names were Strelzik and Wetzel. They were ordinary people, a mechanic, an electrician, their wives, their children. No military training, no access to high-grade materials, just a small-town life in the GDR, where the biggest dream you were officially allowed to have was maybe a new television after years on a waiting list. One evening, they came across a simple idea. Hot air rises. If they could trap enough of it under a giant envelope of cloth, maybe, just maybe, they could float over the border, above the mines, above the guard patrols, above the very system that said they belonged to the state. They did not have nylon or industrial fabric, so the wives began buying bed sheets and bolts of cotton bit by bit from different stores so no one would get suspicious about a huge purchase of cloth. At night, in cramped apartments, they spread the fabric on the floor and sewed panels together, pretending it was just another household project. Every stitch was a quiet act of rebellion. In secret notebooks, the men calculated volume, lift, fuel consumption. They had no computers, no access to engineering textbooks that were not approved by the state. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union launched satellites and boasted of its missiles. But here, in a tiny East German town, two families were trying to outrun a superpower with nothing but math scribbled on scrap paper and a second-hand propane burner. On a July night in 1979, the first version of their dream rose into the dark. Under it, the Strelzik family with children on board. The balloon climbed, drifted towards the border, and then hit a cloud. The fabric absorbed the water, grew heavy, and began to sink. Imagine being one of those children, the basket shaking, the wind roaring, your parents desperately feeding more fuel into the burner. On the ground below, a landscape you're not supposed to see from this height, guard towers, searchlights, and suddenly the realization you are falling back into the country you were trying to escape. The balloon crashed. Miraculously, no one died. They missed the west by less than 200 meters, 2 football fields short of freedom. At dawn, border troops found the wreckage of the balloon and knew someone had tried something bold. The secret police, the Stasi, launched an investigation. They demanded lists of anyone who had bought large amounts of fabric or gas. They knocked on doors, questioned clerks, combed through receipts. For the families, the clock began to tick. They had failed, and failure in a dictatorship is not just embarrassing, it is dangerous. But instead of giving up, they doubled down. If the first balloon had almost made it, a second, better one could succeed. Now they brought the 2 families fully together. 4 adults, 4 children, and 1 last chance. They worked like possessed people. A new envelope, bigger, better stitched, a stronger burner. This time, they calculated the exact wind direction needed and watched the weather obsessively, waiting for the perfect night. When that night finally came in September 1979, the forest clearing where they set up the balloon felt like something out of a fever dream. They spread the fabric, inflated the envelope with a fan, lit the burner. The huge shape rose, glowing orange in the darkness like a paper lantern. And then came the hardest part, getting the children into the basket without anyone panicking. You can tell a grown man, stay quiet, don't move or we die. You can't really say that to a 6-year-old. They loaded the basket. There was no safety margin, no backup plan, only fire, canvas, and faith. As the balloon rose, a mistake in how the guys released the lines caused it to lurch. For a moment, the envelope dipped toward the burner, flames licking at the fabric. One wrong second and the entire thing could have turned into a fireball with 4 children trapped inside. Somewhere in the chaos, one of the boys hit his head on a metal fitting. He started to cry. His parents, hearts pounding, begged him to be quiet, partly to keep from waking anyone nearby, partly just to keep their own terror from exploding. But the balloon climbed. 2,000 meters, air growing thin and cold. The children shivered in clothes never designed for high-altitude flight. Below them, in the darkness, was the border. On the ground, Soviet-designed searchlights swept the countryside. In the sky overhead, American satellites silently watched the same frontier, measuring the strength of the Iron Curtain with lenses and film. The families didn't know exactly when they crossed the line. There was no dotted boundary, no sign, only the rhythm of the burner and the howling wind. Then the fuel began to run low. The balloons started to descend. They braced for impact, crashing into a field, sliding, tumbling. They had no idea where they were, still in East Germany or in the West. The adults pushed through the dark with the children, walking towards the nearest road. At last, they saw a sign, a language, a style of lettering, West German police uniforms. They had done it. 2 working-class families, 4 children, and an enemy superpower, and the side with the more powerful rockets and tanks had just been outmaneuvered by a flying patchwork of stolen sheets.
Not every escape was that spectacular. Some were small, quiet miracles, resting on a single human decision. Picture this. It is August 1989. The Cold War is entering its final act, but no one knows that yet. In the East German city of Karl-Marxstadt, a schoolgirl named Peggy grows up in the gray routine of socialism. Her father, Hans Peter, is a quiet man with a stubborn streak. He refuses to play the regime's game. He does not fake enthusiasm in sham elections. He asks uncomfortable questions. The secret police notice. They always notice. One day, his wife is granted permission to visit relatives in Austria. Just her, not him, not the child. This is how the system works. It lets one person travel, counting on the love they feel for family members left behind to pull them back like a leash. Hans Peter looks at his 7-year-old daughter and understands exactly what that means. The state is using her as a hostage. So he decides they are not going to be hostages anymore. He does not tell Peggy they are fleeing. He just says they are going to see Mama. She is 7. For her, this is an adventure. For him, it is a life-or-death gamble. Father and daughter traveled to East Berlin. They walk the streets near Checkpoint Charlie, the famous crossing point between East and West. On one side, Soviet tanks, East German border guards, anti-vehicle obstacles, layers of concrete and steel. On the other side, American MPs, West German police, the neon lights of a world the East keeps telling its people is rotten to the core. Hans Peter needs help. He cannot just run. The border is too tight. So he does something most of us would be too afraid to try. He starts approaching strangers in uniform. Think about that. You are in one of the most heavily watched cities on Earth. There are informants everywhere. And you walk up to foreign soldiers and say, without words, "Will you risk your career and maybe your freedom to smuggle me and my daughter out in your car?" He tries once, twice, 3 times. People recoil. They shake their heads. They know the risk. Then he meets an American, a young soldier named Eric. We do not know exactly what went through Eric's mind in those seconds. He had been raised on stories of the Cold War, told that the Soviets were ruthless, that Berlin was where World War III might start at any moment. What we do know is that in the end he said yes. He drove his small car to a side street, opened the trunk, helped Hans Peter and little Peggy climb inside, curling their bodies around the spare tire, pressing themselves flat. The lid closed. Darkness, cramped metal, the smell of gasoline and carpet. For the little girl, this was a game of hide and seek. Her father told her to stay very quiet. She pressed a finger to her lips, treating it like a secret mission. For Hans Peter, every second was agony. From inside the trunk, he could hear the muffled sounds of the engine, the crunch of gravel, the echo of boots, possibly even snatches of Russian or German voices. The car pulled into the checkpoint. Outside, East German guards and Soviet officers were trained to be paranoid. They knew the tricks people used: hidden compartments, fake gas tanks, secret panels. They also had access to advanced tools, mirrors to check under cars, and in some cases, thermal detection equipment to spot the heat of hidden bodies. Technology, again, on the side of the dictatorship. But this time, technology cut both ways. It was a hot day. The car had been sitting in the sun. The trunk was an oven. Everything glowed with heat. If a thermal sensor swept past, it might not see 2 extra bodies at all, just a single blazing mass of metal. Inside, sweat poured down Hans Peter's face. He could feel his small hand resting on his arm. She shifted a little, trying to get comfortable. He fought down the urge to beg her not to move. Minutes dragged by. A border crossing that normally would take seconds felt like an eternity. And then, at last, the engine revved. The car rolled forward, past the last barrier, across the painted line, into West Berlin. They did not open the trunk immediately. Eric drove a safe distance, away from prying eyes. When he finally stopped and lifted the lid, fresh air flooded in. To Peggy, it might have looked like any ordinary street, but to Hans Peter, that patch of asphalt was the United States and its allies made real, a place where a man in uniform had chosen to break the rules of a military bureaucracy in order to honor something deeper, an instinct that children should not grow up in a prison. In the official tally, the Soviets had tanks, nukes, missiles. On that day, 2 Western strengths mattered more: one American soldier's conscience and the idea that freedom was worth smuggling into the trunk of a car. Not all stories ended with triumph. Some ended in trucks that stalled too soon, in boats that sank too soon, in families separated forever at the last barrier. In 1964, Western newspapers reported that two East German couples tried to flee with 11 children packed into a truck, an entire rolling kindergarten aimed at the border. The details are sparse, the emotions are not. Parents trying to keep a baby from crying while soldiers with automatic weapons stand a few meters away. Children old enough to understand whispering to younger siblings, turning the escape into a whispered fairy tale to keep them from making noise. When you hear Cold War, you might think of spy planes like the U-2 flying above 70,000 feet to photograph Soviet airfields and missile fights. You might think of the Corona spy satellites, camera capsules dropped from orbit and caught in mid-air by American aircraft, revealing how far behind the Soviets really were in long-range missile production. In that sense, yes, the Soviets were shocked by American technology, by the precision of it, by the way it quietly stripped away secrecy from thousands of miles overhead. But there was another kind of shock happening at ground level. Every time a family made it across in a homemade balloon, or in a modified car, or squeezed into a shepherd's trail through the forest, it sent a tiny message through the Iron Curtain. A message that said, all your tanks and all your barbed wire can be beaten by one father with a plan, one mother with a needle and thread, one child brave enough to stay quiet in the dark. And on the West Side, those stories landed with a different kind of pride. Not just pride in military strength, but pride in being the destination, in being the place families risked everything to reach. If you want to feel that pride as an American, you don't have to imagine it. Listen to the voices of Berlin children in 1948 and 1949. 3 years after World War II, Berlin was in ruins. Food was scarce. The Soviets tried to cut the city off completely, blocking roads and railways to force the Western Allies out. Once again, the United States answered not just with guns, but with planes. Day and night, American and British crews flew cargo aircraft into West Berlin, landing every 3 minutes, delivering food, coal, medicine, everything needed to keep more than 2 million people alive. From the ground, kids watched the constant buzz of engines, the silhouettes of C-54 Skymasters against the sky. One of those pilots was a young American named Gale Halvorson. He noticed children standing behind the fence at Tempelhof Airfield, watching the planes, hungry but not begging. They told him, "Don't give up on us. If we lose our freedom, we'll never get it back." Halvorson did something small and brilliant. He started tying candy bars and chewing gum to little parachutes made of handkerchiefs and cloth and dropping them out of his plane on approach. The kids learned to spot his plane by the way he wiggled the wings. They called him Uncle Wiggly Wings and the Candy Bomber. Word spread. Other pilots joined in. School children in the United States sent candy and homemade parachutes across the ocean. By the end of the airlift, American crews had dropped more than 23 tons of sweets on tiny parachutes over Berlin. To a hungry child, a candy bar falling from the sky is magic. To a Soviet propagandist, it was a nightmare. How do you compete with that image? You can show parades of missiles, you can paint slogans on walls, but you cannot erase the memory of chocolate floating down from an American plane. Now connect that scene to the ones we've already visited. A little girl hidden in an American soldier's trunk at Checkpoint Charlie. 2 families in a patchwork balloon drifting toward the west. Berlin kids catching candy with their bare hands.
Across all of them, the pattern is the same. On one side, a system that tries to confine, control, and surveil. On the other, a coalition of engineers, pilots, and ordinary people who keep punching holes in the wall, sometimes with perfectly engineered spy satellites, sometimes with bedsheets sewn together in a living room. For Americans watching this, there is a particular emotional twist. In a lot of World War II videos, you see Germans stare in disbelief at the firepower and industrial output of the United States, the mass-produced bombers, the endless convoys of trucks and tanks, the sheer scale of the arsenal of democracy.
In the Cold War, something similar happened, but quietly, in the shadows. Soviet generals studying blurry U-2 photos of their own bases realized that American cameras could see almost everything. Party officials, reading secret reports on satellite imagery, understood that decades of propaganda about Soviet technological supremacy were lies. Behind closed doors, they were the ones feeling the chill of inferiority. But at the same time, in gray apartment blocks from Leipzig to Prague, parents huddled around illegal radios, catching jazz and rock and roll from the West, hearing advertisements for American products, listening to unfiltered news. Their children might have gone to marching practice with red scarves and then come home and, late at night, listen under the covers to a different world crackling through the static. If you grew up in the United States, surrounded by this technology, TV, cars, supermarkets, the early internet, it can be hard to imagine what it looked like from behind the wall. It wasn't just stuff, it was evidence. Evidence that another way of living was not only possible, but real. That is why these escape stories hit so hard. When a father risks his kids' lives in a balloon, or a mother agrees to hide her child in a truck, they're not just running away from poverty. They're running toward a specific mental picture. Supermarkets with full shelves, schools where you can ask questions, a future where your child grows up to choose a job, a city, even a country without a party document deciding for them. For many of those families, the West and America blended together in their imagination. West Germany was physically closer, but America was the myth. Jeans, cars with big chrome grills, Hollywood movies, and a constitution that said something radical, that your life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness belonged to you, not to the state. So when you, as an American viewer, watch a story about an East German father trusting an American soldier with his only child, or children chasing American candy parachutes through the rubble of Berlin, you are not just watching foreign history. You are, in a way, watching your own country through their eyes. Of course, the Cold War did not end all escapes with children. New borders replaced old ones. Now the deadly frontiers run through deserts, jungles, and oceans. Families fleeing war in Syria load their kids onto rubber boats and push off into the Mediterranean, knowing that thousands have already drowned on that same route. Parents from Venezuela and Haiti hike through the Darien Gap, one of the most dangerous jungles on Earth, with toddlers on their shoulders, crossing rivers where people disappear in the current. The technology has changed. Now there are drones overhead, biometric scanners at border checkpoints, satellite phones in the hands of smugglers. But the core equation is the same. Parents calculate risk, look at their children, and decide that staying is worse. If you trace that line backward, from the Darien to the Mediterranean, from there back to Berlin and the Iron Curtain, you start to see a pattern in how borders work. They are built from concrete and wire, yes, but they are also built from stories. The Soviet Union told a story. We are the future. The West is decadent. America is collapsing. American pilots dropping candy on Berlin told another story without saying a word. East German parents sewing balloons in secret added their own chapter. Every time someone crossed that frontier with a child in their arms, they made the wall a little less absolute. They turned a symbol of Soviet power into something else, a backdrop for human courage. So what should you do with these stories, sitting where you are now, watching on a screen that would have looked like science fiction in 1961? First, remember that behind every big geopolitical headline, there is always a small scene like this. A father counting how many minutes his child can stay quiet in a trunk. A mother teaching her daughter that the distant rumble of aircraft means food, not bombs. A kid pressing her face to a smudged window, trying to catch a glimpse of the world she has only heard about in whispers.
Second, appreciate what it meant and still means for the United States to be on the receiving end of those journeys. It is one thing to boast of aircraft carriers and stealth bombers. It is another thing to know that ordinary people have for decades pointed at your flag and told their children that is where people like us can be free. And finally, understand that the technological edge that shocked the Soviets, spy planes, satellites, precision engineering, is only part of the story. What really terrifies authoritarian regimes is not just what America can build, it is what America represents when someone looks at a wall and thinks, my child belongs on the other side of this. In the end, the Cold War was not won only by missiles or markets or even information. It was also won quietly, night after night, by families who refused to let their children's lives be written by a dictatorship, by pilots who dropped candy, by soldiers who opened their trunks, by engineers who pointed cameras at the sky and said, "We want to see the truth," and by people like you, decades later, willing to sit down, listen, and remember.